Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Australian Renewable Fuels Week, our second Renewable Fuels Week and our first time in Canberra. I'm delighted to advise that the event is completely sold out, so we are expecting to have a full house. We still have lots of people coming through the front doors at the moment, but we're kicking off, and we will do that with every session, so we're starting without you, encouraging you to come in. I'd also just ask that we don't leave sort of free seats in between, if possible, so that we don't end up with 50 people standing at the back of the room. So firstly, Canberra is obviously the host city for Australian Renewable Fuels Week. It's also the country that has been home to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people for more than 20,000 years. We wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people as traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on and recognise any other people or families with connection to the lands, the ACT and the region. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. We would also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending the event today. I would like to thank our sponsors for the event. We have quite a few, so forgive me. BP, Ampol, ExxonMobil, EDL, New South Wales DPI Beyond Fossil Diesel, Neste, CEFC, AGIG, Enerac, Gemina and Green Power. Now for Green Power as a sponsor, to give you a little indication, Renewable Fuels Week is being powered by Green Power, and we've been certified by Green Power as being powered by accredited renewable energy. By using Green Power, Renewable Fuels Week has prevented 5.4 tonnes of CO2 equivalent. So the equivalent of powering your air conditioner at home for 135 hot days or running your washing machine 106 times in 1 year. So thank you, Green Power, for supporting the event. Now, Renewable Fuels Week, 2 big days, talking about renewable liquid fuels and renewable gas and the essential contribution that they need to make in supporting, in particular, hard-to-abate sectors of the economy. We are absolutely delighted with the speaker program that we have, and I'd like to thank our speakers and all of our delegates that are joining us today. I'd also like to thank the Bioenergy Australia members. I've been on board for 5 years now, and it's been 5 hard years, and we're certainly starting to see some movement in this space. And it's fantastic to have had those members on board for such a long time and to be able to see them now starting to be engaged in some really positive action moving forward. To kick things off today, we are absolutely delighted to have the Honourable Catherine King, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government. Minister King has made some significant announcements in this space since taking this position. The announcement of the Jet Zero Council, the moving forward very rapidly with the Aviation Green Paper, the Transport Net Zero team. We've been absolutely delighted to be working with not only her office, with her personally and also the department. It's been a fantastic collaboration and absolutely looking forward to hearing some words from you this morning. Thank you, Minister.
Thanks very much, Shahana, for that kind introduction. As always, I too begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. The transport industry interacts with and impacts on every single corner of our nation, and when you get to the heart of it, it is imperative that our drive to net zero and renewables is about protecting those very same environments that First Nations communities have been protecting and cherishing for time immemorial. The example of those communities have shown in caring for place and country should be at the front of our minds as we discuss Renewable Fuels Week. Also welcome to the National Gallery. I hope you get an opportunity to go and have a look at the collection, which really the gallery holds on trust for all of you and every Australian. It's an extraordinary collection and a beautiful place here in Canberra. Not enough people get to see it, so please take the opportunity to do so. And I can also highly commend the gift shop. Margie Osmond might tell me, I think they might have won a tourism award this week. I'm not sure, but I think they might have. If they haven't, they deserve one. As we all know, 2 years ago, this government was elected with a clear mandate on climate change, and our ambition is now law, setting a 43% target by 2030 for Australia's emission reduction and net zero by 2050, and you would have had the opportunity to hear from Minister Bowen last night about some of the plans and the work that he is doing to get there. We are within striking distance of meeting our 2030 target, and now we're setting our sights further to developing our plan to net zero by 2050 together as a government and as you are in industry. In that journey, I know that renewable fuels have an essential role to play, and that's why I've championed their development ever since we came to government. One of my first speeches as Minister back in July 2022 was in fact focused on renewable fuels, particularly in the aviation sector. I'm sure that some of you will remember that because it was at a Bioenergy Australia event. At that event in Sydney, I committed to establishing an Australian Jet Zero Council because I knew then that not only did we have a lot of work to do to develop renewable fuels in Australia, but that every step on the way we had to work closely with industry to actually achieve that. I made that commitment in one of my first speeches as a minister because I know full well that aviation, heavy vehicles and maritime transport have limited decarbonisation opportunities, and if we are to achieve our ambitious targets, we need to develop renewable fuel industries right here in Australia. The challenge is large, but we must achieve it. Domestic aviation emissions in Australia more than tripled between 1990 and 2019, and Australian jet fuel demand is projected to increase by 75% from 2023 to 2050. Together, domestic aviation, heavy vehicles and domestic maritime transport are projected to be close to 10% of the national emissions in 2030. Emissions from heavy-duty trucks, buses and rail doubled between 1990 and 2021. And liquid fuels, including petrol, diesel, jet fuel and biofuels, make up 52% of Australia's final energy consumption. If we're to achieve our goals, we have no choice but to decarbonise this consumption and these sectors, and that means more renewable liquid fuels. The challenge is why my department will shortly be conducting its final consultation on the draft Transport and Infrastructure Net Zero Roadmap and Action Plan, and I acknowledge Ian Porter, who's driven much of that work in my department, is here with you most of the day. It's designed to support the reduction of transport and infrastructure emissions. This roadmap and action plan is one of 6 sectoral decarbonisation plans that are currently under development, covering all major components of the economy. Late last year, we sought initial suggestions and ideas from stakeholders from the transport sector plan, and I thank those of you who contributed to that. Through this process, we've heard of the challenges ahead of us, but on the other side of the coin, there are many opportunities as well. Australia is well placed to lean into a low-carbon liquid fuel industry. We have access to renewable feedstocks, and progress is being made to set up local production facilities. Detailed public consultation on our overarching plan is expected earlier this year. However, we are already exploring some discrete elements of the renewable fuel mix, like the development of sustainable aviation fuel through other mechanisms. And I'd like to briefly explore what we're doing in the areas of aviation, of maritime and heavy road vehicles. In aviation, as we all know, aviation is absolutely critical to the way in which Australians go about their work and go about ensuring that we're connected to the world. Indeed, I'm sure many of you used aviation to get here today. On a per capita basis, we are second to the United States for annual emissions from domestic flights, and if you add in international flights, we rank 5th in the world. Our government knows this and is committed to working with the sector to support the reduction of Australia's emissions while growing jobs, including through sustainable aviation fuel and emerging technology. That is why we established the Australian Jet Zero Council, which is working with the sector to identify opportunities for collaboration and to promote, mobilise and galvanise industry's own efforts. It's also why we announced $30 million of sustainable aviation fuel funding initiative through ARENA. And it's why we've committed to an aviation white paper process which has been examining the full range of issues across the sector, emissions reductions among them. The preceding aviation green paper noted that sustainable aviation fuel is the most advanced means to support net zero by 2050 in this sector. Over 2,000 submissions were received on the green paper. Consideration of these will of course inform the white paper, which I intend to deliver in the middle of this year. Moving on to the maritime sector, to decarbonise shipping is looking to evolve from a single universal fuel to a future with multiple alternate fuels. Given the global nature of the industry, this will be a huge transition, especially given the uncertainty surrounding supply locations. We are working hard to ensure we play a key part in the transition, given we are the largest island nation in the world and the 5th largest user of shipping services, which carry over 99% of our international trade by volume across more than 400 community commodities in and out of Australia. We are pursuing this at the international level through our participation in the International Maritime Organisation negotiations and our consistent ongoing collaboration to develop green shipping corridors. We're pursuing this at the national level by working closely with the maritime industry to develop a maritime emissions reduction national action plan. The plan is to set the strategic direction and recommend actions to decarbonise our own maritime transport sector, as well as contribute towards reducing international shipping emissions. The plan will seek to identify opportunities and future-proof the domestic maritime industry, ensuring that Australia benefits from the global net zero maritime transition. Again, I expect to receive the draft plan by the middle of the year. Meanwhile, a few of our current actions towards reduced maritime emissions include investing in the development of clean hydrogen industrial hubs near ports to produce renewable hydrogen-derived fuels, including for ships. Engaging internationally to establish green shipping corridors to support the export of our renewable energy products, and reviewing and developing responsive regulatory frameworks, such as developing a domestic guarantee of origin certification scheme for locally produced hydrogen. In the heavy road vehicle space, next when it comes to those, there have been some advances in battery, electric and hydrogen technologies. Nevertheless, I know that there will still need to be a role for low carbon liquid fuels for many years to come, particularly in sectors like long-haul freight. Low carbon liquid fuels, such as renewable diesel and biofuels, have the advantage that they can be used in conventional internal combustion engines to varying degrees, and as such they will play a key role for that sector. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of challenges, but the opportunities are really clear, not only in terms of decarbonisation, but importantly in terms of jobs. Modelling for Australia's bioenergy roadmap estimates bioenergy could potentially contribute 26,200 new additional jobs by the 2030s and over 35,300 jobs by the 2050s, with at least 1 in 4 additional jobs expected to be in our regional areas. And as a regional MP, that is important to me. I know that there is so much work to be done in this space. I know that we can't do that without the support and collaboration with industry. I know that's why this event is so important. The opportunities you have to discuss what you are doing, what you think government could do more of, and also to provide that advice to government through Shahana is a really important opportunity today. So I wish you all the very best with your conference today, and I wish you all the very best with your deliberations over the course of the next 2 days. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We very much appreciate it and look forward to working with you in the future. I would now like to welcome Bruce Sutherland from ExxonMobil, who is the sponsor for our first session. It's looking to be a fantastic session, although I did notice we didn't have a really good gender balance here for this session, so we're going to work on that one for next time. I think we definitely need a lot more female leaders in this space coming through, so I would encourage that. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Shahana, for that introduction, and I do apologise for not helping with the gender balance here. So, look, it's an absolute honour for ExxonMobil Australia to be able to sponsor this session today. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Canberra area and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank Minister King for taking time out of her very busy schedule to be with us today as we continue to explore the immense potential for renewable fuels to help decarbonise Australia's emissions. So, I am thrilled to be opening the session today about accelerating the deployment of SAF around the globe and actually closer to home. And I'm very much looking forward to, as I'm sure you all are, hearing from what is a very experienced and diverse group of speakers. So, Over to my left, you can see Kelvin Lee from IATA, Jack Shepherd from Blunamy, ExxonMobil's very own Tamid Mizan, Robert Boyd from Boeing's Global Sustainability Policy and Partnership Teams, and Jimmy Smartsis, who is the CEO of LanzaJet. A team, oh, well, there you go. I was going to say they asked me to put that slide up and it's already there. So, anyway, first let me talk a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to talk quite a lot about ExxonMobil. So I am happily married, a father of 3 young adults. I have one very old dog and I have a puppy, and this group continues to surprise and mostly challenge me on a daily basis. I've worked at ExxonMobil for 25 years, and I was absolutely thrilled when last year I was asked to head up the business development group for Asia Pacific. Now, obviously business development includes low emissions fuels. And what really stood out for me about this new opportunity was that while I was excited about it, my kids were absolutely thrilled. And the reason for that was that they were pleased that action was being taken by a global company who has both the capability and the scale to deliver solutions that will have a real impact across the globe. We see that as critical for the future. So, ExxonMobil Australia is one of the country's oldest energy companies, and it was first established over 125 years ago. Our company has unmatched global, regional, and local experience across the entirety of the jet supply chain, all the way from feedstock through to the wingtip. Everything in between, obviously, as well. And we've been supplying aviation fuel to customers like Qantas for over 100 years. Over that time, we've continually evolved to keep pace with Australia's growing demand for energy products and to leverage ever-improving technology. In our long history as an energy supplier to this great nation, we've seen a multitude of changes. And it is our view that all lower emission fuels, including SAF, have a vital role to play in the energy future for Australia. They, in fact, are essential. At ExxonMobil, our people are working hard to keep the lights on, to keep homes warm and people moving, while also reducing emissions. This is what we call the AND equation. The AND refers to making sure that those products are also affordable. We plan to invest over $20 billion US dollars on initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through to 2027. A significant share of that will be focused on scaling up our carbon capture and storage operations, but also hydrogen, and importantly for today, biofuels. As part of this, we want to make sure that we can do our part to supply low emission fuels, including SAF, to meet industry demand. Our goal is to provide 40,000 barrels, or roughly 6.3 million litres a day of low emission fuels by 2025. We're planning to scale that up to over 30 million litres per day by 2030. And to achieve those goals, we continue to focus on investments in markets that have well-designed policies that support technologies and that reduce life cycle emissions. As an example, in Canada, we are currently building a renewable diesel plant at our Strathcona refinery that is supported by Canada's clean fuels regulations. And in late 2023, we also started co-producing SAF at our refinery in Gravachon, France. And when it comes to transport sector, it's very clear that a diverse mix of technologies will be absolutely crucial as we track towards net zero. So, EVs and hybrids will obviously have a role to play, but I believe that it's equally important to figure out how we can reduce the emissions that come from the millions of cars, trucks, planes and trains that currently run on liquid fuels. The truth of the matter is that they're not going anywhere anytime soon, and electrifying them isn't always an option. So we need policy, and that policy needs to encourage investments in all technologies to reduce emissions, especially in these hard-to-abate sectors, and that obviously includes aviation. This requires a new way of thinking about the entire transportation system, and that requires considering the life cycle carbon intensity of fuels and how to make these cars, trucks, and especially planes operate more efficiently. We believe that the lowest cost option to reduce transportation emissions is a low carbon fuel standard. And so if you're not familiar with that term, a low carbon fuel standard is a policy that encourages emissions reductions across the entire life cycle of both vehicles and the energy source, from production and processing through to on-road use, regardless of whether a vehicle has or does not have a tailpipe. We believe that a low carbon fuel standard is faster, cheaper, and a better way to reduce emissions across the entirety of the transport sector. It would also allow all Australians to contribute to decarbonising, even those who cannot or do not want to purchase an EV. And for the aviation sector, a low carbon fuel standard can support the gradual introduction of sustainable aviation fuel over time, as it gives the government the latitude and the opportunity to pace emissions reductions with the availability of feedstock and of SAF, and that will help to ensure that passengers in Australia pay a fair price. Later this morning, you'll hear from our Global Regulatory Development Team head, Tamid Mizan, who will share our view on ways to accelerate decarbonisation in Australia's aviation industry and how we'll do that through a low carbon fuel standard. He'll also talk a little bit about how various policies around the world are already in operation and are already working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our skies. But for now, I'd like to introduce our first speaker this morning, Kelvin Lee, who is IATA's Assistant Director for External Affairs and Sustainability for the Asia-Pac region. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Kelvin from IATA. It's a real privilege for me to be here to meet with all of you at the Renewable Fuels Week. Before I start my presentation proper, maybe just a quick introduction to IATA. We are the global trade association for the world's airlines, and we have some 320 member airlines around the world, including those that are based here in Australia, Qantas, Virgin Australia, and Link Airways. Well, just a quick recap in this commitment to net zero made by both the airlines and the governments, and you'd see that there's very good alignment with the airlines coming together in 2021 to look at a flying net zero commitment at the 77th IATA AGM, and this was quickly followed by an agreement between the governments around the world on a long-term aspirational goal at the 41st ICAO Assembly. And following that, what IATA did was we developed a set of 5 net zero roadmaps to look at the steps that we need to take to bring aviation to net zero. And it's clear through these roadmaps that airlines alone cannot get there, and we'll need to collaborate with stakeholders, both within the sector and also beyond. So through aircraft technology, using newer and more efficient aircraft that also looks at using new propulsion technology, energy and infrastructure, which we will look at in more detail later, and also continuing the good work of operations, improving the efficiency of flying that we have been doing so well for the past 5 decades or so. More importantly, it's also leveraging the enablers, finance, because we estimate that we will need to take some $5 trillion to get aviation to net zero. So really expanding the discussion beyond this room of like-minded colleagues. And also, more importantly, is policy, because that ties everything together. We know for a fact that private money would always follow public money. And also it's so important for policy to bring all the stakeholders together, not just within the industry, but also across the different government agencies, transport, environment, agriculture, science and research, for example. So based on the IATA's estimates on how aviation can get to net zero, we estimate that the use of SAF will contribute some 2/3 of the total net zero plan. And that is why we think that SAF will be the most important decarbonization lever for aviation, as you can see in the bar in green on this chart here. And that's why, following the net zero commitments by both airlines and governments, we saw another very positive outcome last year at the ICAO CAF3, that's the Conference on Aviation and Alternative Fuels, outcome that was in Dubai. So we had achieved a 5% CO2 emissions reduction by international aviation in 2030. And this is quite a momentous agreement because it also focused more on emissions reductions rather than just the volumetric use of SAF. What IATA did is that we actually did a forecast of the number of international flights we envision would be flying in 2030. And we came up with this number, 682 million tons will be emitted by these international flights in 2030. 5% of that would come up to about some 34 million tons. And based on the study of the types of SAF we envisage will be available in 2030, that will mean some 14 million tons of SAF would need to be used. So if we keep this magic number of 14 million tons in our minds, again, we see very good alignment between the governments and the airlines in terms of the policies that have already been announced around the world. So we envisage that through these policies, it will enable some 17 million tons of SAF to be used in 2030 around the world. And this includes the whole range of policies, the US SAF Grand Challenge, the mandates in the EU and the UK, and then also closer to this region, the recent announcement by Singapore to put a passenger levy to purchase SAF. While there has not been much formal policy announcements from Australia yet, well, we do look forward to what the minister had already shared, the net zero roadmap, and also we look forward to also the announcements on the aviation green paper. In terms of the commitments by the airlines, some 64 airlines have already committed voluntarily through agreements and commitments, and this will amount to some 15 million tons of SAF being used. And we also know that many of our airline members, including Qantas, are also directly investing in SAF. So where the bottleneck we envisage, it's really on the production and supply of SAF. Because today, based on the announcements that we see so far, the total renewable fuel capacity out there is about 65 million tons. And this could potentially grow to some 80 to 90 million tons based on growth rates and future new announcements. But because some of these might not materialize, so if we just take into account the 65 million ton number, it would actually mean that aviation would need to secure 20 to 25% of this total renewable fuel capacity in order for us to reach that goal of 40 million tons by 2030. And if you take a look at the map, well, we do see some bubbles in Australia, but we certainly hope that through the discussions over the next 2 days, the bubbles will grow bigger and more numerous. And another quite concerning part that I would like to zoom in on is on the numbers. So last year, we saw a total production of about 0.5 million tons of SAF. Well, that's quite an encouraging number because it was a doubling from the year before in 2022. And we do envisage that this year it will triple to about 1.5 million tons. But the concern is really that in the total renewable fuel capacity, SAF still makes up on average just 3% of that. And we are talking about having to secure some 20 to 25% to reach the ICAO CAF3 global vision. So just to put this in a bit more context in terms of the scaling up that we need to do, if you look at the arrow that points down, Between today and 2030, we actually need to scale up some 28 times in order for us to reach that CARB3 global vision of 14 million tons. And at IATA, because we project out all the way to 2050, we actually have an intermediate goal, which we call the tipping point, and that is even more ambitious because we hope to see the use of 24 million tons of SAF by 2030, and that actually translates to a scaling up of 48 times. So the numbers are quite depressing, but I would say that we can be optimistic because we do see a very big SAF playing field. There's been quite a lot of activity concentrated on the left-hand side of the field for now, but I think things are really getting busy with all the other parts of this field, and that's what we hope to hear over the next 2 days as well. And what's also quite optimistic is that the field will actually grow with more and more players, and that is really important for this transition of aviation because it's all about a team effort to get us there, and it's not about dependence on a particular star player. So with that, I'd like to come to the end of my presentation with a call to action. So 4 points. I mentioned the enablers earlier, finance and policy, and that's where we really think that action should be taken. Firstly, more and faster investments into SAF, both by traditional fuel companies as well as by new fuel companies. Secondly, how do we incentivize this production to optimize the amount of SAF? Again, I go back to the number of having to secure 20 to 25% of the total renewable capacity in order for us to transition towards that goal in 2030 alone. Third, and I think this is very important for Australia and the region, what are the feedstocks, the pathways, and the production methods that will work for Australia and the region? It's quite important for us to get that right. And last but not least, one of the good ways to actually stimulate the demand further beyond the physical use of SAF by airlines is through the use and recognition of a global SAF accounting framework that will really help to boost production and also bring down the cost for everyone who is using SAF. With that, I look forward to the discussion further. Thank you very much.
In the year ending June 2023, there were over 500,000 regular passenger transport flights across Australia, contributing about 7% to the total emissions from the transport sector. Now, to combat this environmental impact, major domestic airlines in Australia have pledged to decarbonise their operations by 2050. However, to achieve this requires significant changes. For instance, if just 10% of the fuel used in those regular passenger transport flights was to be replaced with sustainable aviation fuel, we'd need nearly 800 million litres a year. Now, to put this in perspective, the global output for sustainable aviation fuel last year was just 600 million litres. Clearly, we have a dual challenge, not only to decarbonise aviation in the fight against climate change, but also to accelerate the supply of clean, sustainable aviation fuel. I'm Jack Shepherd, manager at Blunamy, which is a consulting firm that works with business and government to navigate and help accelerate their energy transition journey. Blunamy are an active member of Bioenergy Australia and developed the Bioenergy Roadmap for ARENA that was published in 2021. Now, within that roadmap, we identified the potential for using Australia's bioresources to help decarbonise the aviation sector. And today, we continue to support businesses and governments with their opportunities and challenges to help decarbonise aviation. Now, for the next 8 minutes or so, I want to explore 3 questions with you. What are the challenges that we face? How can we overcome them? And what can Australia do about it? So, before I address these 3 questions, I just want to briefly touch on how the aviation sector can decarbonise. And like many sectors, the aviation sector has a suite of tools it can use to help reach net zero by 2050. This waterfall diagram, adapted from the International Air Transport Association, sets out a clear pathway for decarbonising the sector. But by far the largest contribution, shown by the light green bar, will come from alternative fuels. And when we say alternative fuels, what we're talking about here is sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, and the opportunity to directly drop in and replace fossil-based jet fuel. Now, when we consider the production pathways available, the majority of SAF produced today is via the hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids route, also known as HEFA. Now, this mature technology faces several challenges moving forward, and in particular, the competition for feedstock resources. However, there are 3 emerging pathways that are now becoming commercialised and that aim to complement the HEFA process. And these are the gasification plus Fischer-Tropsch, the alcohol to jet, that are both a little more flexible in their feedstock sourcing. And then there's the power to liquids route, which has fewer physical feedstock constraints, but requires large amounts of renewable electricity. Now, each of these emerging pathways come with their opportunities and challenges, which brings me to the first question I want to explore. So I'm going to cover 2 challenges that we face in developing a SAF industry. And the first one is that we need to diversify SAF production using all the pathways I've just described. As demand for SAF increases, more and more pressure is put on feedstock resources, which increases competition between other bioenergy products. For example, agricultural waste and food waste can be used to make biogas or renewable diesel, increasing the need for SAF suppliers to secure a sustainable supply of feedstock. Indeed, we can see from this market outlook here for SAF production capacity across the EU and the US, the established HEFA process, shown by the green segment, is expected to plateau due to feedstock constraints. And our best approach is to diversify production to optimize our feedstock and production capacities to meet global SAF requirements. So in essence, we need all the pathways we can get our hands on to meet our SAF needs. The second challenge is that SAF will remain costlier than fossil jet fuel. And we can see from this graph here that all the production pathways have a general trend of reducing costs out to 2050, but remain above today's price of jet fuel. And when we consider the cost levers for the HEFA and the alcohol to jet pathway, the feedstock pricing plays a key role there. Whereas for the gasification plus the Fischer-Tropsch and the power to liquids pathway, the costs are very much driven by the technology. But these challenges that I've just described should not be considered as barriers to adopting SAF, which brings me to the second question I want to explore. So how can we overcome the challenges? And I want to highlight 3 ways in which we can do this. The first is that we need to improve the overall production value chain, which means working on short-term opportunities that enable the production through HEFA, while developing the long-term emerging pathways. The second is to use a bit of a carrot and a stick approach that makes SAF more attractive and fossil-based jet fuel less enticing. And the third is to bring it all together by creating cohesive policy conditions. And this brings me to the last question I want to explore. So where does this leave Australia and what can it do? Well, let's start by looking at what others are doing. So in the European Union, they're using very much the stick rather than the carrot to drive demand. And so the EU is setting mandates for SAF blends from 2025, which means that every flight out of an airport within the EU must have a certain proportion of SAF within that fuel mix. But not only that, the EU is also driving demand for SAF from different types of processes and production pathways. And from 2030 onwards, there will be a minimum amount of SAF produced from the power to liquids pathway that must be in the fuel. And these mandates are expected to increase out to 2050 until about 70% of the fuel mix will be coming from SAF. On the other hand, the US is using the carrot to encourage large volumes of domestic SAF production. And they have a national production target of 3 billion gallons, or equivalent to about 11 billion litres per year by 2030. And that's the equivalent of nearly 4,000 flights between Melbourne and Sydney a day. And by 2050, the US plans to use 100% SAF for its domestic flights. They also have the Inflation Reduction Act, which poses a risk to Australia by diverting capital and resources. But the government, US government plans to provide a tax credit of between 30 cents and 50 cents per litre for eligible SAF produced. Now, if we compare that to the average price of SAF in 2022, that's a 15 to 30% reduction or credit for producers, which is not an insignificant amount. In Australia, we have made some progress in on a few different fronts. For example, the Australian Jet Zero Council that was established last year is a step towards having a single agency dedicated to decarbonising aviation. Airlines have also taken initiatives to decarbonise their flights. For example, Qantas has made commitments on SAF blending by 2030 and taken steps to secure SAF through various deals with suppliers. And Virgin Australia has been working with Brisbane Airport, trialling SAF as far back as 2017. And lastly, at the federal level, the government is providing financial support to projects through the ARENA SAF funding initiative. But there is more to be done, and perhaps Australia needs to use a combination of the carrot and the stick approach to help unlock the SAF industry, like setting a national target for SAF, giving a common goal for the industry to work towards, supporting different production pathways, leveraging Australia's renewable electricity potential, biomass resources, and potentially the remaining 2 refineries. And finally, encouraging SAF supply and demand at the commercial scale by creating a framework to appropriately distribute the cost of SAF at the value chain, including to the airline's end customers. Australia has the right tools and resources to decarbonise our air travel, and by taking a methodical, long-term approach, we can achieve our net zero goals. I'll be around for the next couple of days. Looking forward to speaking to as many of you as possible, understand your opportunities, challenges, and how Blue Enemy might be able to support. Thank you for your time.
So, good morning. First, I'd like to start off by thanking Bioenergy Australia for organizing this really rich conference. And I know it's good. We're going to have a really extensive and fun time talking about renewable fuels in particular for aviation. So the title of my talk is Navigating a Lower Carbon Aviation Future for Aviation. And I think, my passion is about policy. And I think through the talks this morning in this panel and through my own presentation, you'll start to see that policy will be that guiding beacon for aviation to achieve decarbonization. A little bit about myself before I begin my presentation. Tamid Mizan, work in the global policy and regulatory affairs. 25 years with ExxonMobil. I'm a proud US citizen, but I was born, grew up, and got my engineering education in Bangladesh. And so, to me, I understand that energy poverty and economic poverty goes hand in hand. So when ExxonMobil talks about the AND equation, which is providing accessible and affordable energy today, as well as looking to the future of a transition to a net zero world, I fully understand what that means. It means providing energy to the 8 billion people that are in the world today so that they can move to where they need to be, so they can heat or cool their homes, so that they have clean water and other provisions of modern life. So as we think about transitioning, as we think about a low-carbon future, we need to ensure that this happens in a smooth way without disruptions to the market, without shortages, so that the economy can proceed in a smooth and orderly fashion. So there's the AND equation. Bruce earlier talked a lot about what ExxonMobil is doing towards the goal of a lower carbon future. He talked about the $20 billion or more that we intend to spend. I'll expand a little bit on some of those points that he talked about. So, indeed, we intend to spend a lot of money over the next 5 years up to 2027, focusing on areas where we think we can bring a lot of our skills and capabilities to bear, in particular carbon capture and sequestration, biofuels, hydrogen, and now lithium. And I'll go through the pictures on the right to exemplify some of those activities. So we're going to be producing blue hydrogen in our huge manufacturing complex for petroleum and petrochemicals in Baytown, Texas. That involves producing about 1 billion standard cubic feet of blue hydrogen to really switch the fuels that we use in these refinery complexes and to get to a lower carbon state, if you like. And that will involve sequestering 7 million tons of CO2 per year. So quite a huge task, but one that we think is needed as part of our own mission and vision. Our aim to get to net zero with our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2050, and then staged approaches and activities all through 2030 and plans to get there. Bruce mentioned our targets to produce over close to 200,000 barrels a day of biofuels, and about the Canadian project that we have to produce renewable diesel in Strathcona, Canada. And at the bottom left there, you see a picture of a drilling rig where we intend to produce lithium for the world's electrification needs, to provide lithium for the batteries that the world will need. We've secured access to 140,000 acres in Arkansas, and we will extract lithium from the rich brines that are about 10,000 feet below the ground. And so we intend to do this in a very environmentally limited way and a very carbon efficient way. So some of the things that we're doing. And of course, we are focused also on aviation, supplying fuel to our customers in the UK, in France, and in Singapore, and co-processing biofeedstocks with petroleum feedstocks. And that might be a way to get a lot of production out with existing kit that's out there. Now, all of our efforts will need to be matched by policy. Policy is a recurring theme. As we look forward to making these investments, without policy, some of those will not, will be challenged. So it's important to pace those investments with policy, and of course, at the end of the day, the customers are what matters, and so their commitment is also part of that journey forward. So that's a little bit about ExxonMobil. I want to talk next about aviation and give you a bit of a picture of what aviation looks like for us. So starting on the left is aviation fuel demand. So the good news about aviation is that it is a growing industry. The demand for aviation is growing by leaps and bounds. We heard some of the statistics from earlier presenters. If that trend continues business as usual, that'll mean a huge demand on aviation fuel. You can see a lot of that demand will actually come from non-OECD countries, which is the light blue wedge on top. As this fuel demand grows, under a business as usual scenario, of course, the emissions will increase. Right now, it's about 900 million tons a year of CO2 emissions, and that will no doubt increase if nothing is done. But indeed, we do have to take steps to address that growth in emissions. and that will require unprecedented effort, collaboration, and innovation. SAF will be a big part of it, and I think Kelvin showed some charts of how an important role that SAF will need to play to get there. SAF, of course, as the previous speakers have outlined, is more expensive than mineral jet fuel, which also means that the structure of some of the economics of how airlines operate will need to also adapt to the new reality. Policy will play a very important part in that transition and in attracting more SAF into the aviation market. So let me say a few words about policy without giving you the answer of this is the right policy or that policy will work for Australia. You know, as we look to the future, as we look to the energy transition, we in ExxonMobil thought deeply about policy constructs, and we came to the realization that whatever your policy preference is, there are some principles that underlie thinking about good policy, and I'd like to share those with you. So it really starts with knowing what the societal goal is. Is it carbon reduction, greenhouse gas reduction? Is it economic development? Is it jobs? Is it agricultural growth? Is it energy security? And different countries and different regions will have different societal goals, and they will need to be balanced. And that's part of the political and the deliberative process that we're going through right now in this room. That balance is essential. Recognizing how to measure progress towards that goal is also essential. So Bruce talked about life cycle carbon accounting. That's a way we know exactly whether our steps, our efforts are paying fruit in terms of actual emissions reductions. Once you've established a goal, you need a strong scientific basis to move forward and design your policy around that science. You need a strong legal basis to move forward in terms of your policy. Once you've established that basis, you need to ensure that all pathways, all technologies, all solutions are encouraged by your policy, because you never know what will come out of left field and actually achieve the targets that you have. And then you need to promote the wise use of resources, whether it be land, capital, and so forth. And usually markets are a very good way of doing that. And finally, providing a strong market signal so that investments can occur and close the gap and achieve your societal goal. So looking across the world today, what kind of policies are there in terms of sustainable aviation fuel? We essentially see two kinds of policies. One are obligation-based policies or mandates. That's in the dark blue. You can see in Europe and a few other parts of the world. Or others are incentive-based policies, and Kelvin talked about the IRA, and actually Jack also talked about the IRA in the US. So there are these two different dichotomies in terms of carrot or stick. Which is the right answer? And the question of what is the right answer for Australia, we hope our panel will be able to deliberate and discuss and perhaps even come out with an answer for that. With that, let me thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Good morning. I was reflecting over the weekend just what can change over the course of a lifetime. And it got me thinking about what my grandfather's life was like. Born in 1903, October. Prevailing wisdom at the time was that no machine heavier than air was capable of flight. Of course, 2 months later, that was completely disproved by the Wright brothers. You know, when they had their remarkable flight on the 17th of December, it was about 800 feet and managed 59 seconds. By the end of my grandfather's life, this type of thing was possible, not quite this aircraft, but more or less in the 90s, anywhere on planet Earth was almost reachable in a single flight. I thought it was an interesting reflection when we think about energy transition and just how complex and tough what we're trying to do, especially at the micro level. But when we zoom out a little bit and think about what can be achieved over generations, it's not a precise parallel, but an interesting one. Let's look back a little bit before we look forward in terms of SAF and SAF development. I think about SAF progression in phases. So this first phase I call the test and development phase. 2008, that's when the very first flight, it was February 2008, London to Amsterdam on Virgin Atlantic, and it kicked off SAF experimentation of these fuels, and then other airlines followed. The big step then was a certification, HEFA, June 2011, and this instigated a wave of activity. Several airlines starting to do it, and many thousand flights, a lot of very useful information gained, but most of this was bespoke activity. 2016 was pivotal in changing the thinking. Right, we started to have the first continuous production of SAF, which went into a hydrant installation in LA. You had Corsia approved by the ICAO Council, the Offsetting and Reduction Scheme. That was a big step. The CAF2, we heard about the CAF3, but there was obviously a CAF2. There was not much activity leading into the CAF2, but CAF2 really spurred, I think, a lot of what came after. Some things like sustainability criteria. It was only in 2018 that globally there was an agreed set of sustainability criteria, really important stuff. Daily flights continued. By 2020, 7 technical pathways in place. By the time of the CAF3, coming off the back of a disastrous period for aviation with COVID, a terrible period, some 80 offtakes announced just in those 24 months prior, and nearly 40 to 45 billion in offtakes just those 24 months prior to CAF3. So as you've heard already, CAF3 was, I think, a great success, a 5% goal for international aviation, and puts us in an interesting period right now as to how do we achieve that if we look forward. We're in this window where we can still make a difference for 2030. Get to a point with the lead time required for projects. We'll get past 2026, and most of that's going to benefit beyond 2030. But we still are in a 24-month window where we can shape the numbers that get achieved in 2050. And those agreements have been referenced already. The industry committing to net zero, obviously 2021, and then all states, 193 states in 2022. Only global sector to find that level of coordination. That shouldn't be overlooked. What's needed? Well, I call it the 4 quadrants of success. So technology, feedstock, policy, and then commercial and economics. Okay, it's not revolutionary, it's fairly straightforward, but my assessment of the top 2 is it's at least a credit. You know, we're in quite a good position when it comes to 15 years of groundwork on technological developments for SAF, and the same on understanding feedstock and biomass potential globally, and how do we certify it as sustainable. Policy momentum is changing incredibly quickly, and we'll have a look at that in a moment. That's a positive, and I'd say there's still more work to do when it comes to the commercial and the economics, but we're starting to see some good examples. Who needs to be there? This is important. We should never overlook this. It's the 4 important stakeholders. It's the aerospace sector, obviously. It's the energy sector. It's new and traditional. We need finance. They have to supply the money. We just heard $20 billion on the Exxon spending coming up. But we estimate about $20 billion is needed to achieve the 5% number. So that's good context on those numbers. Finance must be there, and policy's pivotal. Boeing and SAF, we've been involved in this development for exactly the same time frame, not surprisingly, but just a couple of highlights here from the first flight. Testing on military platforms has been, I think, invaluable. 100% SAF testing in flights. That's going to be important as we get further out towards 2050. I highlight 2 others. The CSI, in terms of biomass and feedstock, the CSIRO roadmap with Boeing last year, I think really important and useful document. You must understand your feedstock potential before you can convert that into liquid fuel projects. And then partnerships. Partnerships is vital. We've had partnerships since 2022 with suppliers. The most recent I'd like to highlight just in the last week is with Wagner Sustainable Fuels. Really pleased to be able to develop that as we move forward up in Queensland. That's going to be exciting exciting stuff. Quick look at policy. I just want to walk us through what I think is a snapshot of what the policy landscape looked like. It was a sparse globe for SAF policy. Only 9 years ago, there was a lot of renewable fuel policy for ground sector, 60 countries. But SAF, it was very, very hard to even get a decent credit, say in the US or Europe. It was complex. By 2020, it started to change. Definitely, it was a US-EU story. You were able to, for instance, opt into the low carbon fuel standard in California, the renewable transport fuel obligation in the UK. The early work was brewing for the Refuel EU policy, which we just talked about. But let's go to current day. There are dots everywhere at the moment. It's almost too hard to follow if you're in policy analysis in this area. I estimate about 65% of all jet fuel uplift, in terms of global uplift, has a SAF policy, SAF-specific policy, either in place or under some form of development. So there's been a dramatic change there. Don't forget what's happened with ICAO. That's been incredibly powerful here in all countries just recently agreeing to this 5% target. So you could almost put a dot everywhere, but maybe not quite from ICAO. But these public-private initiatives are also providing a big tailwind. Bioenergy Australia, Jet Zero Council in Australia and New Zealand, making a big difference, plus these roadmaps and other initiatives like SAF accounting. If you add up all these policy initiatives too, I roughly get to about 20 million tonnes. And we talked about 24 million would get us to 5% at a global level. So that's an interesting benchmark. More to do, but not bad. I'm going to skip through this only to say that there's still a gap between how much supply is necessary relative to, on a probability-weighted basis, there's about 109 SAF announced projects in a global sense today. And if we apply probabilities to those, they're not all likely to succeed. We get to about 17 million tonnes as the expected number. So it says there's still work to do, but the bottom-up analysis is interesting. There's plenty of these sorts of data sets. This is the Boeing dashboard. I think they're very informative when you want to look down in regions or specific parts of the world or types of SAF being developed, and there's others that do the same sort of analysis that I recommend. Use this data for your analysis there. And just wrapping it up, what is needed to get SAF off the ground globally? Well, again, this is my interpretation of it that I've seen over the past couple of decades. And some of those countries, the front runners in the policy have, I'd say, gone down the OECD path. That's a bit of a generalisation. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you're an OECD country, you sit in that swim lane there. But you do need all of these things. It starts with knowledge building, coalition building, feasibility studies, policy settings. Then you typically move to this point, financing and construction. That's a difficult part, and that's where we're at in some parts of the world that are making the most progress. And then ultimately we get to production. Production's great in a sense because it's going to become boring. It's going to become business as usual, and we won't all be having to talk so much about that. But we have to help the developing and the top tier move as fast as possible towards what's gone through the OECD chain of development here. I'll leave you with this, just a final thing. I think everyone, if you've been to conferences and presentations on this topic over the past decade, you've probably seen this at the start of every chart. I think I've used it 100 times in talks. Tear it up and go digital. Cascade.boeing.com. Okay, it's a bit of a sales pitch. This is public. It is the wedge chart, but it's the wedge chart for you to be able to explore any scenario to net zero. I mean, essentially that wedge chart I just showed is a pathway to net zero. It's a schematic, but it's static, right? This is any possible scenario you like, any type of technology combination, feedstock, carbon intensity of a grid, well worth going and taking a look at, whether it's policy, whether it's SAF development. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Jimmy Samartzis. I'm the CEO of LanzaJet. It's truly an honor to be here with you today and share a little bit of our perspective on a technology called alcohol-to-jet, but also about our company and what we think is a significant opportunity here in Australia. I'd like to start off with the vision statement of our company. Just take a minute to review it. For us, we started the company with a clear mission to focus on aviation. We are clearly a SAF company. We're an engineering and technology and production company that is focused on SAF. It's clear that aviation has a significant impact on our global society, whether that means bringing our communities closer, enabling global commerce, and so on, right? It has a significant impact, and we saw what happens when you pull back on aviation during the COVID years, and how distant things felt, how supply chains were not working at the time, right? Planes weren't really moving. And we started the company in 2020 when aviation wasn't flying. If that gives you a sense in terms of the ambition we had at that point in time. The letters in yellow spell our Earth. It's sort of our commitment to protecting what we see from above when we travel down below. Let's talk about building a new industry, because I think sometimes we are myopically focusing on technology or production and the gallons instead of thinking about what we're really trying to do here, which is building a new industry. As Robert mentioned, this activity has been going on since 2008. I frankly feel relatively old at this point because I was involved with it starting in 2008 during my years at United Airlines. But the reason why we're doing this can be many, right? And you heard references to this a little bit earlier. It could be because of climate and decarbonization. It could be because of economic development, domestic energy security, national security. There are truly different reasons why it matters to have a sense of urgency around SAF today. And when I think about Australia in particular, I think about the incredible opportunity it has around rural economic development. Creating your own system for domestic energy supply, creating a national security scheme to help give you fuel, considering the challenges that perhaps are just north of the country and supply chains that you are dependent on. So there are different reasons why to care about building a SAF industry, but pick your reason, and depending on what country you're in, those reasons may vary. You heard these numbers earlier today in various fashions, but I think it's helpful to put it a bit into perspective. Where we sit right now is 600 million liters of SAF were produced last year, right? 0.6% essentially. Sorry, 0.6 billion liters, right? The objective here by 2030 is to get to 18 billion liters. We have 6 years to get there. Robert rightly pointed out that we have a couple of years' time to actually deploy technology that can actually have an impact on that ambition by 2030. The question I have is there really the urgency to get there, right? Depending on, again, what country you're in, that urgency may be there. In many countries, the urgency is still lacking. Let's talk about, though, why this is hard to do. There's risk across every dimension that you look at here, starting with technology, policy, which is still in development, having the capital available to invest in major infrastructure assets, and supply chain risk. And at the same time, you're also looking to help an 80-year-old fossil fuel industry transition. It's hard to do. And for me, it starts with the technology. You heard Robert mention 7 pathways, or 8 pathways, I think, approved by ASTM to date. There's an additional 5 or 6 in the pipeline. Lots of different ways to get to SAF. But technology has to work. Most SAF technology companies have not succeeded over the last 15 years. Right? HEFA is a technology that has succeeded, has been commercialized. It is feedstock constrained. Right? And what you're seeing in places like China, where China is now deploying its own HEFA technology, a lot of that HEFA feedstock comes from China as used cooking oil. Guess what? That feedstock is going to stay within China instead of being exported out. So you have to start with, from my perspective, having technology that works, which is why I'm excited to share with you what we do at LanzaJet. From my point of view, alcohol-to-jet might be the holy grail. I was having a conversation during coffee hour today where someone said, you know, HEFA is really where it's at. And it is true, HEFA is where it's at today. But can alcohol-to-jet really be something that can be pivotal for the industry? I think it is. I think some of you may be questioning that. Some may be smirking. Some may be skeptical. I'm doing it intentionally, right, to get a little bit of a reaction. But let's talk about ethanol to SAF and why I think it could be the holy grail. When you talk about versatility and flexibility, ethanol as a molecule is extremely important because it's a building block molecule to get you exactly to SAF. The question is, how do you get to ethanol? We think of ethanol as being a source, the source for ethanol being energy crops. Corn ethanol, sugarcane ethanol, sugars essentially. We can also create ethanol from woody waste and agricultural residues. We can create ethanol from carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide. We can create ethanol from MSW. These aren't a dream, right? These things are actually happening today. We come from a company called LanzaTech, which was founded in New Zealand. They are a publicly held company today. They have 6 commercially operating plants around the world that take waste carbon and convert that to ethanol. So ethanol is not just the ag molecule, it's also every other feedstock that we've been talking about. It's relevant globally, so depending on what country you're in, you can pick and choose how to get to ethanol. Australia has a lot of bio feedstock available, or the potential for it. It also has a lot of industry, so how do you capture those industrial waste emissions from industry and create ethanol as a bio-intermediate or as an intermediate feedstock to get to SAF? You can do all those things. And then at the same time, you're actually creating a new market for ethanol. If you think about today's global market, there are 30 billion gallons of ethanol produced around the world today. Most of that goes into road transport as a blending component. Road transport is electrifying. So that capacity can pivot and provide a feedstock for aviation. That's existing capacity, let alone all of the new capacity that you can develop through those waste streams. It's economic development. Our first plant, which is now operational, is in Georgia. It's in rural Georgia in the United States. It's an energy security story. It's a national security story. There's many reasons why alcohol-to-jet is relevant in different countries around the world and different outcomes that come from it. So for us, we are currently expanding globally. We have quite a bit of activity here in Australia. We have a publicly announced partnership with Jet Zero Australia, and that project is in Queensland. Very exciting for us to be down here, and there's other things that we're also doing in Australia. You also have an opportunity to continue to improve the carbon intensity of alcohol-to-jet. If you think about corn ethanol in the United States, the greatest opportunity there is to capture that CO2 that comes from ethanol production and sequester it. Or alternatively, take that CO2 and make more ethanol from it. We have work going on across the states in that regard. I mentioned this earlier, but truly, we have an opportunity to get to ethanol via any number of feedstocks. These are all real situations for us where we've taken a raw material that you see up here on the screen and converted that to ethanol. It is truly an unlimited potential supply of feedstock across the globe. When it comes to our company, we are the first to have commercialized the technology. We did all the work for 14 years. Our technology started with the US Department of Energy in a lab environment. We scaled it up from lab to pilot to demo to commercial. And we had ASTM approval achieved in 2018. It enabled us to do the first cross-Atlantic flight from Florida to the UK with Virgin Atlantic, and the first flight across the Pacific from Washington State to Japan with All Nippon Airways. We have a great group of investors, companies like Shell, Suncor, Mitsui, British Airways, and most recently Southwest Airlines joined us as an investor. We talk about the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions quite a bit. We have nearly a 95% reduction in particulates, nearly no sulfur in our fuel product. And the thing we are talking more about these days is the energy density. Our SAF has a higher energy density than the fossil equivalent, nearly 10% higher energy density than its fossil equivalent. We also have a partnership with Technip Energies, which helps us deploy our technology on a global basis. Technip's technology for dehydration is the first step in our process. It's called Hummingbird. And that actually, along with the next step, which is oligomerization, enables us to get to 90% of the product mix as SAF. That is truly unheard of when you think about technologies that get you to SAF. All we produce is SAF at 90% and renewable diesel at 10%. And we can easily flip that to 75% RD and 25% SAF or anything in between. Truly gives you a lot of flexibility. That's my bell. I need to get off stage here shortly. So just quickly, we are doing work on many continents in 25 plus countries, from places like Kazakhstan to India to here in Australia and certainly Europe. I did want to share with you, we had the grand opening of our facility in Georgia. This is a quick little video clip. We had 400 leaders from across the industry gather together to celebrate the power of partnership and collaboration to build a new industry. It was kicked off by the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, and the Deputy Secretary of Energy, Dave Turk. The Secretary of Agriculture talked about this takes dreamers and warriors. I did want to share that sentiment with you. It does take folks who can do the visioning and the development of novel technology, but it also takes folks who are willing to execute on that path. And then I'll leave you with a video, and hopefully this does work. So before I do that, though, thank you for giving me the opportunity to share our story.
How does change happen? It happens when extraordinary people in extraordinary places have a will to change the world. It happens down newly made roads, in 100,000-gallon tanks, through miles of metal pipes, fueling our means of connection from above. Change takes decades of operating experience, hundreds of years working in fuel and related industries, to create new jobs, to propel countries to collaborate, to produce 1 billion gallons of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. Change takes thinking bigger. Technology, policy, airlines, investors, and flyers. Everyone, everything, working in lockstep so that we can continue to travel, explore, innovate, connect, make industry move, enable an energy transition, and ensure a shared, sustainable, net zero future for us all. Not in 5 years, not tomorrow, today. It starts at LanzaJet Freedom Pines Fuels.
Thank you.
All right. I think it's my turn now to moderate this panel, this esteemed panel, and try to extract a little bit more of their views in terms of sustainable aviation fuel and what it means for Australia. So let me start with this question for you, Robert, which is, can you think of a time when the aviation industry, the airline industry, underwent a very, very significant challenge and had to pull together to overcome that? So thoughts and how did the airline industry react to that challenge?
That's a good question.
Did you turn it on? There you go.
On helps. It's a very good question. Aviation, I think, has gone through waves of challenges, certainly since the jet age, whether they be things like pandemics, whether they be strikes or disruptions. Typically, aviation, I think, is one of the, if not the industry that is incredibly organised at working together and overcoming, challenges. I sometimes use this example when you think about, we take it for granted a little bit when we get on an aeroplane these days, but sometimes it's good to pause and think about every single thing that's going on to make a very seamless experience on an aircraft. That's collaboration with hundreds of different stakeholders. So I think that's probably the biggest trait that aviation has in its favour, to go through change, and there's experience of that.
Yeah, it's a very resilient industry, and we saw through the COVID challenge how it's bounced back and is stronger than ever. And, the challenge that aviation has in front of it in terms of decarbonization, and really the SAF being a strong part of that story, is a different kind of challenge, but one that will require collaboration of every part of that value and economic chain, if you like, to make this happen. Turning to Kelvin, we talked about the CAF3 and the 5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions through the application of SAF and LCAF by 2030. And you actually had in one of your slides the two different ways in terms of policy. One is incentives, the other is mandates. Could you tell us a little bit from an airline's perspective, which one is preferred and why, and which one do you think can get us to some of those ambitious targets, the 28 times multiplier to expand that SAF? Thoughts, Kelvin? Yeah.
Right. Thank you for that question. I think it's not a zero-sum game. It's not choosing carrots over sticks, for example. And we did see something quite new, for example, in Singapore, where they are looking at passing on the cost directly to the passengers themselves, rather than having it on the suppliers or on the airlines. So I think it's really a combination of what works to bring down the cost and to boost the supply. I would say a combination of all different levers possible would be the best outcome for airlines.
Thank you, Kelvin. Jack, just thinking about, one of the challenges out there is feedstocks. All SAF starts from some kind of a feedstock, whether it's agro-based, forestry-based, waste-based. So in terms of the Australian challenge of getting access to sufficient feedstocks, and then the double challenge of ensuring that those feedstocks are sourced sustainably, give us your views.
Yeah, thanks, Timid. It's a good question. It's one a lot of our clients ask us about, in terms of how much feedstock is there, how sustainable is it, what is the impact on the environment of using that feedstock as well. And there are opportunities in Australia for sourcing sustainable supply for a SAF market, but it can be quite context specific in that we need to consider the lifetime of using that feedstock source versus the competing interests. Right? So we need to think about the merit order of using that feedstock as well. Is SAF the best use for that feedstock? At the top of the chain, we should really be prioritising, as long as it's not bio-waste, feedstock for whether it's human consumption or animal consumption, materials, and then start to look at, okay, well, where can we use it in the energy where the alternative is too far away or it's prohibitively expensive or it just can't be done from a technological perspective. So there's no one right answer, but we work to dive into those complexities of feedstock sourcing and understand how it can play out for the rest of the project or the SAF market.
Thank you, Jack. Back in terms of the SAF challenge, we saw some of the numbers out there. An IATA goal, I think, has been talked about, 65% SAF by 2050. That will require, according to, I think there was a paper published by ATAG, maybe $1.5 trillion, and that's probably an underestimate, could be even more than that. So capital is the name of the game. And capital is mobile. It can go anywhere in the world, really. And so to you, Jimmy, what can Australia do to attract the capital? And clearly, you showed us a great example of investment towards a new technology in SAF. What can Australia do to attract the capital to grow that SAF business, increase that scalability, and make this really happen?
Thank you for that. And I think So just yesterday in Sydney, we had a SAF forum that had about 50 participants, 90% of them which were from the investment community. So I think capital and the interest in capital is there, right? The question is, how does a project or how does an effort get de-risked? And what that private capital is looking for is also government support to ensure that there is some support on both ends, both on the infrastructure development as well as on the product side. So I think here in Australia, there's a great opportunity where you have, in our world, right, you have sugar that today is being exported outside the country. Keep it within the country, create ethanol from it, and create a fuel product from it. You have the feedstock supply where you can actually develop the industry. You have capital that's very keen to be deployed. The question is, how does that capital get comfortable with the risk associated with that product? Qantas and Virgin Australia both have efforts to support with offtakes, but again, airlines can't withstand but so much of a price discrepancy between fuel or fossil fuel and SAF. So the question for me really is, how do you have the Australian government step in to support this new budding industry here? You can do that with grants, which there have been some limited grant funding that has been available and been deployed. How do you extend that to grants that can support infrastructure development at this point? In the United States, we've had good success with loan guarantees. I know there's a way to do that here in Australia. How do you enable that for SAF projects? And then on the back end, in terms of some revenue certainty mechanism or a mechanism that enables some subsidy for the difference in price between SAF and the fossil equivalent. Right? So I think government is really critical, and once government supports, private capital is going to flow as they see that less risky.
Thank you, Jimmy. Any other members of the panel wish to weigh in on how Australia might attract more capital into SAF production?
Just to echo that, it's not a capital problem. It's a business case. There's money all over the world ready to find a home that can make the right return, and it's risk, as Jimmy just said. It's ensuring that, there is an education piece, there's a capacity building piece as well with the finance sector. So I think those forums where this group is speaking to the finance community and helping them understand much of what has just been talked about does help their comfort then in leaning into that investment thesis. But when that can happen, capital's there, and the policy really is what unlocks the business case.
Very good. Thank you, Robert. I'd like to come to another nuance that's embedded in perhaps in policy, and it's the concept of book and claim. The objective is really to get greenhouse gas emissions down all over the world. Aviation is a global business. Does it matter where that emissions reductions happens relative to where it's booked? And that's a question I'd like to pose to Kelvin. Thoughts about book and claim? And first of all, explain it to the audience, please. What is book and claim, and your views of how that might help or hinder growth of SAF?
Thank you. In order to explain that succinctly and not eat into the tea break, I think quite simply it's splitting the environment attributes of sustainable aviation fuels away from the physical use of the product itself. So we don't have that for conventional jet fuels, but of course for sustainable aviation fuels, there's this environmental attributes that is needed in order to reach the emissions reductions goals that we have. So in terms of book and claim, I think that for the airline industry, it's very important because we have many airlines around the world that want to take advantage of the use of SAF today, but are unable to secure supplies, whether it's because they don't fly to the destinations where SAF is currently produced, or that there is probably no intention right now for the countries they are based in to produce SAF. So this is where the book and claim framework is really important, because it will enable such airlines to also tap into the use of SAF to reach their emissions reductions goal. I think what's important again is agreement amongst the states, because what you need is that the government where the airline is based must recognize this booking of or claiming of the environmental attributes in a country away from where it's based. And I think that's where the challenge is, because a lot, as we spoke about, we talked about energy security, we want to make it where it's used, but we also need to confront this new concept of what happens if you are not able to secure the supply. And that's where you actually need for this concept of book and claim to come into action, and for countries to recognize each other's sources and to make it where it's most convenient and so where it's most cost effective.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask a related question to Jack, which is, CORSIA actually allows the use of offsets. And could you maybe give us your views on offsets versus book and claim, and and the relative merits or thereabouts of these two concepts?
Yeah, thanks, Timid. And if we just consider the European approach here by setting mandates from 2025, that's very much about physical supply in Europe. So when you talk about book and claim and offsets, that type of model will be very difficult to succeed there. And when you think about that, that's a lot of pressure for SAF or airports to actually have supply of SAF at each of their sites, which may not be close to a production facility, so there's additional sort of challenges there. So the Europeans' approach is, it's quite strong. They want those mandates, but they may not be playing in a fair market where we can bring everybody else in by having these book and claim models and the offsets as well as a tool for helping to build up the SAF market. And eventually we have enough physical supply such that these sort of models don't play such an integral role later on. But at the beginning, I think they're pretty integral to the system.
Thank you, Jack. I'm going to look to Adele and the organizers. How are we doing for time?
About 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left. So I'll throw it open to the audience. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand and tell us who the question is for.
Hello, Kwame Biko from Zero Petroleum. And my question is for Kelvin from IATA. And the question really is, you mentioned 14 million tons of fuel required for 2030, and essentially SAF. And the question really is, SAF, obviously we know that not all SAF is sustainable, not all SAF has the same properties. So how can we really differentiate between, SAF which, frankly, some SAFs don't even, produce the same sustainability as, fossil-based fuel. How do we create that differentiation and make sure that, we're really looking at carbon intensity and the purpose, which is really to bring down greenhouse gas emissions and make that reflect as well in the cost? Thank you.
Right, thank you for that question. So in terms of the numbers I put out earlier, 14 million tons, at the CARF3 conference, they were really talking about SAF that's used for international aviation, and you know that this is governed by ICAO. So we were really looking at SAF that is CORSIA eligible, and that's, I think, the differentiation, because CORSIA has quite rigorous standards in terms of what it looks at. So that guarantees that sustainability criteria, and based off our analysis, we are looking at average GHG reductions of 70 to 75% that it's then encompassed in that 14 million ton usage of SAF.
Very good. Any other question?
Thank you. It's Dennis here from Wildfire Energy. My question is about cost. Renewables and EVs really only grew quickly when they became competitive with fossil fuels. So what's the most promising, pathway or approach to bring the cost down close to fossil? I'll pick Jack.
Thank you. Well, now if we consider the US's carrot approach to this, in particular providing those tax credits between 30 and 50 cents per litre, you know, those types of mechanisms really help drive the cost down and incentivise the development of more volume. So using more of a carrot approach would be my take on this, to really provide those subsidies to the suppliers of SAF to help bring down the cost and make it more competitive. You saw from my graph, you know, leading out to 2050, for all of those pathways of production, the costs there's a general trend of reduction to 2050, but that's without subsidies. So we could bring those down a lot more if we had those right incentives.
All right. So let me try and bring this to a close to kind of summarize what we heard. So there's another question. Sorry.
Hello, Dave Evans from Defence Science Technology Group. For Jimmy and yourself, Timit. Jimmy, because you've done Heifer now, and you've done A to J, and we're talking about deployment and acceleration and capital investment. What would be the advice you'd provide to new starters who are not going through or not coming with an ASM approved pathway out of the 8 that are on there now? And then the follow-up as well, this goes to Timit, is that with co-processing really taking off, and essentially ExxonMobil and BP and Shell/Viva are pushing for 30% co-processing. What's the role then of emergent industry versus an existent industry that has the capability to produce right here, right now?
Sure.
Maybe not in Australia because we are sold our co-processing offshore.
Yeah, so let me just answer the question, then I can hand it over. So I think I also have done Fischer-Tropsch. So I've done the 3 technologies that I think have the most potential and are involved in most of the pathways. What I would say is buckle in to some degree, right? Because there's so many things and hurdles that you end up having to overcome as you work your way towards ASTM approval and then development thereafter. It's a bumpy ride, right? And at the end of the day, it's important to stay true to the overall ambition, right, in terms of what you're aiming to do. It's not easy, and I think the one thing we sort of gloss over the fact that we have CORSIA, we gloss over the fact that there's a unified aviation approach to this. Take a step back and think about the fact that we had to get 190 plus countries to agree on a single way of doing this across a global market. The aviation industry, I think, is a phenomenal example of how you collaborate towards an ambition and sort of work together to get there. It's quite a testament, I think, to many years of hard work by a bunch of folks. But that's everything that we're doing in building a new industry, and from creating that alignment to new technologies, to creating the supply chains, to thinking about policy. There's just a lot to still figure out, and especially here in Australia, I would say. You have an opportunity here with the May budget coming forward and opportunities that may include something and ambition that certain politicians have. I would lean into that.
Very good, thank you. Co-processing, so role of kind of traditional industries, co-processing and new and emerging technologies and industries. You've seen from the charts that our panelists put on there's tremendous growth that's needed, 28 times or even more, to get to some of the targets that we see out there. So really, there's room for everybody here. Plenty of demand, whether it's HEFA, whether it's alcohol-to-jet, whether it's gasification-based products, Fischer-Tropsch. And I think every technology source needs to participate to get us to those ambitious targets. So room for everyone. Advantage with co-processing is it's out the door immediately. The kit is already there. The steel's already on the ground. It's to tweak the feedstock and to get it there and produce on-spec jet fuel. So it's early to fill that early pipeline, if you like, of that demand, and then other technologies come in and layer on top of that. So with that, if there a final question, okay, we should need to wrap up. Okay, so just to wrap up, then, what we heard that collaboration is needed. We heard that there should be supply side incentive type policies, but also demand type obligation oriented policies, and we talked about low carbon fuel standard as being one that rewards true greenhouse gas reductions, life cycle greenhouse gas reductions, and that might be one way to go. We heard that feedstock is a challenge, and we also heard that it needs to be managed in terms of the context in Australia. We also heard that greenhouse gas emissions reduction is the target, and credible ways to ensure that and enable that through things like book and claim should be explored and examined. So with that, I will take your leave and thank the panel for a really, really rich discussion and wonderful presentations. Thank you.